Thank you for joining us. As many of you will know, our lunchtime art lectures with Robert over the summer proved so popular that he very kindly agreed to host another series of art lectures this term entitled Magical Art. And this is the third of 5 in the series. If you joined us last term, you'll know that these talks helped to raise money for the bursary in Robert's name. And just a few weeks ago, we welcomed back our students on site, and that included the third beneficiary of the bursary to Latimer in Robert's name. And she is an extremely creative and talented artist. So thank you so much for your donation when registering, as many of you have done. Every single gift makes a huge difference to the work that we do. A couple of house rules. Everyone will be on mute, so you can all hear the presentation clearly. As always, feel free to type your questions into the chat facility, and Robert will answer as many questions as time allows at the end of his talk. So on to today's talk. Well, we are delighted and honored to have Robert with us again. Robert taught history of art and cricket at Latimer for 47 years, and he is fondly remembered here by staff, pupils, and parents. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Robert Orme for today's lunchtime lecture, Romantic Visionaries.
Last week, we were looking at the way in which in the 18th century, beliefs in witchcraft, pictures of witchcraft declined because of the growth of rationalism and science. And if you look on the screen, you'll see that these are paintings by Wright of Derby from the late 18th century. And the first one is the one that shows how attitudes to alchemy had changed. So you've got the alchemist working, but the picture is all about how alchemy was really a forerunner of proper real chemistry. And it shows the way in which they discovered by accident phosphorus. And therefore you've got the new chemistry that is looking into real chemical elements. And Wright's next picture, which is the orrery, is one which shows, again, the transformation from a belief in astrology to a real interest in astronomy. And the orrery is a model of the Newtonian universe working by gravity, which was something very popular and used in teaching and education. And again, you can see the look of wonder on little children's faces as they look at the mechanisms of how the universe worked and how, according to 18th century science, they had an understanding of how it worked. But as you know, by the end of the 18th century, you get the development of Romanticism. And Romanticism is very different, where it put lots of emphasis onto human and personal feelings and emotions. And it wanted to create an art and literature that was going to express those emotions. And therefore, it turned back to beliefs in magic and the occult and developed them in ways where they became much more expressive. In the late 18th century, there really were new occult organizations. There were real Illuminati who did actually exist. There was a growth of esoteric Freemasonry. You've got the teachings of Anton Mesmer and Mesmerism. And literally next to me, 100 yards from where I'm sitting here in Hammersmith, there is Hammersmith Terrace, where Philip James de Luterburg, the painter, actually practiced mesmerism and offered magical cures. And therefore, in the late 18th century, there was a revived interest in the occult, and artists like Cosway and de Luterburg got very interested in it. But the particular appeal of the occult to Romanticism really often came in the form of horror. So if you go now to Strawberry Hill, you see a picture box, chocolate box, reconstructed Strawberry Hill, but this 18th century drawing shows what Strawberry Hill was really meant to look like in terms of how Horace Walpole, the writer, lived there, had built a fake medieval castle, and from there wrote his novel in 1764, The Castle of Otranto. And you've got not only the book and the text, but also the pictures, and it's a Gothic horror story of murders, incest, homosexuality, corrupt priests, and therefore you have scenes in it like this, where you can suddenly see the woman startling back in horror at the sight of actually a ghost that is coming to her. And therefore there was an interest in lots of Gothic horror literature and art in the occult. And another artist who at that time got involved in those sort of things was the Swiss artist Fuseli, who actually came to England in the 1780s and produced works of art like this in 1799. And this is called the Night Hag, and it is taken from partly Greek mythology, but also from Nordic mythology, from Lapland, where there were legends that the goddess Hecate, who appears in the sky, could take revenge on her enemies by actually coming and stealing, sucking the blood of babies. So you've got the vision in the sky, you've got the old woman looking after the baby, you've got the innocent child lying there, but you've got the threat of this goddess, this witch, coming to her and stealing the baby's blood. And his most famous painting is the Nightmare. And this was widely diffused as a print. He did several versions of it, and it's thought to link particularly to his own kind of life, where he had unsuccessful love affairs, where he had rivals who took women away from him, where he produced erotic, often pornographic kind of art. And therefore he took the traditional image of the nightmare, where the little goblin-like figure sitting on the woman is an incubus. And you may remember from what we were doing on witchcraft that incubi and succubi were really supposed to exist. They were supposed to be real incarnations of the devil who took on human form and came to have sex with humans on earth. Therefore, he sits on her. And then our term nightmare is linked to the horse's head that you see on the left. And that is partly to do with folklore, where a nasty dream is a kind of night visitor. But literally, it is a nightmare because the elf, the incubus, is literally riding her. And if you look at the pose, it's very obviously post-orgasmic. It's very obviously to do with a sexual fantasy about horror in relation to sexuality. Therefore, you have these kind of extreme emotions that appealed much to the Romantics in these paintings and drawings and novels of Gothic horror. But arguably the most interesting of the Romantic artists is going to actually be William Blake. And if you look at his painting of Newton, where you see here the image that he famously created of Newton doing a version of the universe, it shows you what is probably one of the main fundamental beliefs of Blake, where he absolutely hates the rationalism and science of the 18th century. And this figure of Newton, who explains everything in the universe by means of maths and gravity, is, I think, meant to look really sinister. He is very powerfully muscled. He is very intense and gazing down onto the universe that he's creating with his compasses. And there are lots of texts where Blake rails against rationality, science, and the way that it actually destroyed the life of the imagination and how it destroyed feelings that he wanted to express in his art. So he was very anti the rational tradition, and he grew up in a family which had links to Protestant mysticism. They had connections with German Moravians, and also he himself was much influenced by the teachings of the Swede Emanuel Swedenborg, who produced books of visions of heaven. And Blake had, it's recorded, visions from a very young age. At 4, he is said to have seen Ezekiel. At the age of about 8, he went on walks into the Surrey countryside, and he came home and described to his father visions he'd seen of angels in trees. And his father beat him because he didn't believe that he was seeing them. But to Blake, they were very real, and imagery of angels appears all the way through his work. And they are, as you can see, like kind of disembodied spirits floating in the sky. Another vision that he had concerned a tragic event in 1787. He had a younger brother, Robert, who worked with him in his studio in Soho, and he was present when his younger brother died of TB. And he described a vision where he actually saw his brother leaving his body, rising through the ceiling and ascending to a better world. Now, this picture, which is in the Tate, is one of his best and most famous images, and it's called Albion, it's called Glad Day, but I think it also represents probably an image of the spirit of his dead brother rising up to a better, higher life in the sky. And he described in writings how he was at times visited by his dead brother, who helped to teach him how to print his own manuscript books. And at the end of his life, he produced this famous image of the Ghost Flea. And the Ghost Flea is dated 1819, and he produced it for an artist who was an astrologer called John Varley, who asked him to do a series of heads and pictures. And Varley describes how this was actually a true vision that Blake had, where he actually was going to paint the flea. He had a vision of it and called it and described it as a ghost, and produced this strange and sinister picture of this flea kind of devil. And he wrote about how he imagined that the devil flea was a kind of flea that would come and suck the blood of good people away, and therefore represented the evils of humanity, which he had suffered from, being nearly imprisoned in the French Revolution, his work not selling, critics mocking him, being called mad. And therefore, this is an image that he believed he directly actually saw of this embodied spirit of evil. He also believed that what he wrote was produced through what is nowadays called automatic writing. And if you look at this text here, the text is actually about how he gets inspiration for what he writes. And then you can see the drawing that he did at the bottom is of the sleeping figure, and above it is some kind of winged spirit that comes to him. And then he produces these prophetic books like Jerusalem. And his poetry can be lyrical and short, as in the Songs of Innocence, but most of the books that he produced are these explosions of dramatic Miltonic prose, which flows through and represents his vision of the world. And as you know from the hymn, Jerusalem is meant to represent the coming back to the world of being good, getting rid of satanic mills and creating a new world where the city of God is reborn. And it should be reborn in Albion. And therefore, when you look at this picture of the Glad Day, it is, I believe, his brother, but also it is definitely Albion, which is his name for England. And therefore, it represents a kind of resurrection of England. And he also believed in and hoped for an imaginary land called Beulah. This is an illustration from Paradise Lost by Milton, and it shows you at top devil who comes into the world and ruins it, whereas below you see Adam and Eve in paradise, and he had very definite ideas about how actually there would be a future world Beulah where problems of sexuality, which he believed were repressed by religion and reason and law, would be removed, and you could get back to the state of paradise, where he talked about how human beings, man and woman, should be able to blend together. So literally you can see them blending, and this blending was the kind of lovemaking that he believed in and wished could happen in the future at Beulah, in contrast to his own probably rather unhappy and unfortunate married life. Therefore, you have this kind of lone visionary, and this lone visionary becomes the person who is an appeal to lots of English mystics in the 19th and 20th century who believed in trying to put forward their own visions. And recently, Jocelyn Godwin has produced this book called The Starlet Years, which is about his parents, Edward and Stephanie Godwin. And it's a book about what their lives were like, what their visions were, and how they lived. They met in 1935 while both were art students at Byam Shaw School of Art, and they had an affair, but they had a problem where Edward was frightened to tell his mother that actually he was in love with this woman, Stephanie. He did actually secretly marry her, not tell the mother that they'd got married. They had or planned to have a baby, and he didn't want to tell his mother, that they were going to have a baby, Jocelyn. The thought was that he wanted to actually have the baby aborted because he couldn't face telling his mother. But his mother had helped him to find somewhere to live because she became the tenant of Kelmscott House. And as you know, Kelmscott House is really William Morris's abode, which he bought in the 19th century. And after he died, it stayed with his wife and his family. And then it was given to Oxford University, and they rented it out to Edward Godwin's mother. And Edward Godwin, therefore, had fallen in love with this woman, Stephanie Godwin. So if you look at the portraits that he did of her, this is the woman that he fell in love with. This is a fairly realistic kind of portrait. And then the next image is a more kind of idealized image that he did of her, and why shows the beauty of why he fell in love with her. But they were poor. They were living in anxiety, trying to hide from his mother that actually they were cohabiting, that actually they were having babies, and that she would disapprove of their kind of lifestyle, where they wanted to live a kind of commune sort of life, where they were going to be vegetarian, they were going to live close to nature in the garden, swim naked in the river. They set up a little school to help children to develop their own personalities. And therefore, they lived this kind of communal life. But it was in the war, in a time of anxiety, and the Starlet Years are partly at least due to the fact that they've been able to get supplies of benzodrine, which is kind of speed, I think, and was one of the sort of drugs that was available in England in the 1940s. And under the influence of the drug and also the problems of their relationship, they produced a very mystical kind of art. As you can see, Edward was really an old-fashioned artist. This is almost Botticelli, isn't it? And it shows you the way in which he was very skillful at creating this kind of fantasy of love and grace in this kind of imaginary world. And this circular picture is of, again, the dancing figure, a joy of a spirit, and it's literally starlit, isn't it? Presumably under benzodrine, you get these kind of light effects and visions, and therefore you get these pictures which include all these stars. But they also, both of them, created an imaginary land called Thesseros, linking obviously to the word eros and love. And it's not always certain which drawings are by Edward and which are done by Stephanie. But basically, it was a world of love. And therefore, they imagined this kind of Gothic fantasy where they could be in love and the trumpet of joy can be blown. And then you get this little boat picture, which is going to be of, again, these two spirits, which are flying the flag of love. And they're probably both meant to be different sorts of eros, because they're little boys winged, aren't they, floating on these people. And therefore, this is a kind of vision that they actually have of their lives. And therefore, you've got this new kind of art being produced under the influence of drugs, creating these mystic visions that they really believed in. And you can still easily buy the Jocelyn Godwin biography with lots of illustrations of these ideas in and quotes from their diaries. And they had lots of fascinating ideas. So you've got these romantic visionaries that last well into the 20th century, but you do also get the development of a new kind of interest in the occult in the late 19th century. And there were lots of new movements of interest in the occult. There was a big growth in what is called spiritualism, where it was believed that mediums could summon up the spirits of the dead. And you have here table rapping, where the dead person raps on the table and answers questions put to them by the medium. And there was at this time use of spirit photography. This next image is of a medium, and then you can see behind the vision of the figure that appears. And it was very easy in seances to actually literally dress people up in white sheets and then have clouds of smoke and explosions so that they thought they were seeing visions of the dead. Or you could do superimposed double exposure photos like this, where again, it looked as though you could really see the dead people. And this movement, spiritualism, interested lots of artists at the time. And we're going to look at the way in which it influenced the De Morgans, Edward, the man who produced the ceramics, and this, which is a painting by his wife, Evelyn. Evelyn's parents had written a book on spiritualism, and they actually got interested in it. William de Morgan was friends with members of the Society for Psychical Research, like Mayer, and Crookes, whose portrait is hanging in the Latimer Hall. And therefore, they actually organized seances. And they wrote books at the end of their lives where they described the visions that they had in the seances, where in a darkened room, suddenly the whole place was illuminated as if by fireflies, it said, and therefore they saw incredible light displays and met spirits of the dead. So Evelyn de Morgan produced paintings, and this is a lake painting by her, and it shows you figures which are spirits, as you can see, from the moon. They're literally coming down from the moon to the earth and meeting presumably her. So this is a kind of spirit vision. And it may also lie behind the kind of ceramics that were produced by William de Morgan. When you look at a William de Morgan tile like this, you can obviously link it to Middle Eastern Islamic kind of art and the influence of their ceramics. You can link it to Italian Renaissance Maiolica and so on. But he's famous for producing these fantasy creatures. And again, these strange creatures are, I suspect, almost like visions that he might have had when he was involved in spiritualism. And then the kind of patterns which so foreshadow the coming of Art Nouveau are like patterns in traditional ceramics, but are they just the patterns? If you were at a seance and there was a light show like fireflies, or if actually spectral beings appeared, or if there was ectoplasm floating round, all these kind of strange swirling shapes could actually be the things that he had thought he'd seen in visions in seances. And he's famous for producing a particular kind of ceramics called lusterware. And when you look at this plate, you have these magnificent monstrous creatures, which are figments of his imagination, but also a new chemical process called lusterware, where in a slide like this, it looks purely red, but if you go to the museums and look at it, you can actually see the way in which light reflects off it, and you get kind of light shows like fireflies coming from his plates. You used to be able to go until 2014 to their centre in Wandsworth, but that got cut by the government and closed down, and is now based at the Watts Gallery in Surrey, where there's an exhibition, and they have an online site where you can find out more about William de Morgan. This is also another way in which maybe you had spiritualist visions in the work of Odilon Redon. And what you've got here is a painting entitled Orpheus, and it's about a legend of Orpheus and his severed head. And when you look at it, you can easily see how it is like a kind of spiritual vision, where you have this head floating in an indefinite space, and then the head itself is actually from the myths of Orpheus having been the originator of the arts, but then killed by Maenads and beheaded. And he also produced this image of the Cyclops. And again, this Cyclops is a visionary image where you have this strange world where the people in it are threatened by this one-eyed monster that is coming to attack them from the hills. And therefore, the interest in spiritualism was not only present in England, but all over Europe. There was also in France a revival of ritual magic. And this is a book by Eliphas Lévy called Dogma and Ritual of Haute Magie. And what it did was to publish the ideas and texts and diagrams of traditional medieval magic on how to actually summon spirits. And when you look at the title page drawing by Lévy, this is a figure called Baphomet, which is supposed to have been the idol of the Knights Templars. And when you look at it, you can see what a dark, strange creature it actually is. It's satanic. It's got the goat's horns that we saw in the Goya. It's also sexually ambivalent because it definitely has breasts, but then it also has an Indian lingam between its legs, and then it's got the intertwined serpents. And therefore, you get an interest in ritual magic, and in particular, in the dark satanic side of ritual magic. And this then has an influence on a movement in the late 1890s that we were talking about last time. And therefore you get books like this, Là-bas, which is by J.K. Huysmans, and he also wrote a book, À rebours, and Là-bas is over there, À rebours is life in reverse, and in it the characters like Des Esseintes go to magic rituals, go to black masses, are secretly practicing magic, and therefore there was a strong what was called decadent movement, which believed that actually using the imagery of magic and black magic was going to be something that could actually express the emotions that they wanted to express about the things that were considered to be immoral by society. So you may remember we looked at several pictures last time by Félicien Rops of black masses, like this beautiful image of the devil in the sky, like in Eliphas Levi, and then the naked woman literally on an altar and being visited by the devil. You also get another artist from Belgium, Jean Delville, who produced this drawing, which is graphite, and is called the Idol of Perversity. And it's therefore very much what would be called a decadent image, because the woman is the evil seductress. She is the bête noire. She is the woman who offers seduction and is perverse. And you have this strange face staring out at us, and then these prominent breasts, and therefore a very dark image. So that in the late 1890s, there was a lot of decadent art produced that actually looked at the dark side of human existence. And some of the strangest images are those produced by Alfred Cubin. He was Viennese. He had tried to commit suicide at the grave of his mother. He'd had a nervous breakdown when he was forced to do military service. And then he trained as an artist and produced drawings and prints like this. And you can see how the artist is actually, again, working from the occult. So this is a dream. And again, you have this disembodied head floating above him as he sleeps. And it gives him the visions that are going to then appear in his paintings and drawings. The next picture is also called A Dream. And you can see how it is a kind of diagonal lightning strike coming down to strike the earth. And look at the dream itself. It's got this strange abstract form, almost like a diagonal, like claws, but it's also got the body of a woman, and therefore is a kind of succubus coming to him as a nightmare. And then his image of life in this picture called Birth is really horrible, where you have the baby being born, but what is the baby born from? The baby is born from the skull, and then the skull turns out to be a crab-like kind of creature, and the baby is trying to escape. And think of how Munch's Madonna of almost the same date is actually, again, a mixture of skulls and sperm, life and death being mixed together. So it's very much part of the decadent theme. And relevant to us is this image, which he also produced, which is called Epidemic. And you have the masses of the world being killed and destroyed. And then you have this strange creature, which is the epidemic that is on top of us. And therefore, you have all these very dark themes in decadent art, which are about Satan, magic, visions, and death. But there was a rival movement around in the 1880s and the 1890s, which was probably fairly much opposed to the idea of the decadence. And this was what was called Symbolism in French. And it revolved around a journal produced by Jean Mauriac. And the poet you might have come across who wrote in it was going to be Mallarmé. And therefore you have in the 1890s a symbolist movement. And this symbolist movement also appears in the work of these painters. Jean Delville is the artist we just saw doing an Idol of Perversity. And he is very much against perversity. And this is a large painting that he produced, which shows what the basis of symbolism was going to be. This is called the School of Plato. And you have Plato seated almost like a Christ-like figure, because he's also Roman Catholic. And you've got Plato and his academy, and he is teaching ideals to them. Because the symbolists believed that you should reject, first of all, the physical material world, and therefore they disliked the kind of way in which the Impressionist painters, who were becoming popular by the 1890s, were doing pictures of everyday bourgeois material life. And instead, they believed in Plato's ideas, where you got back to the world of the spirit and the world of forms. And this is therefore Plato teaching the young to actually rise to the spiritual. And the next picture by Delville is called Splendor, and it shows you at the bottom, as you can see, the turmoil of the world, and the world of the material is twisting around and is in all sorts of convolutions and revolutions. But then he looks up to, as you can see in the sky, this figure, which is going to actually be a figure that again is Christ-like, but is actually basically shown by symbolism, by the colors that he uses, by the light effects that he has. And therefore, you get this kind of movement which was going to want to use symbolism and abstract light to actually get across the idea of the good and the pure and the spiritual. One of the most obvious examples of that was going to be a movement that was developed in the period 1892 to 7 by the Salon De Rose. And the Salon De Rose, this is its poster, was an art exhibition that was put on over 6 times in Paris from 1892. And its poster shows what exactly it was about. It's again about symbolism, because you have the woman on the left, but you see she's being led by a kind of spirit form, a kind of angel. And you see how she's been led to a staircase and how she's going to rise up to the staircase to the light. And this was the creation of the writer Joseph Sarre Peledon. And this is a series of portraits of Joseph Sarre Peledon. He had begun in the 1880s, probably as a decadent, and had written a book called Le Vice Suprême, the Supreme Vice, and had it illustrated by Rops. But by the 1890s, he was trying to project this image of himself as Sarre Peledon, S-A-R. And Sarre meant prophet or priest. And therefore, what you've got is him painted by various people like Armand Point as actually a kind of magician and priest. And that's what he hoped the Salon de Rose-Croix would actually promote. He wanted it to display mystical works which would lead you to a higher plane. Lots of artists exhibited there. And I'm going to just go and choose a few examples. The first picture is by a Swiss artist called Ferdinand Odler, whose style later changed a lot, but who did exhibit with the Salon de Rose-Croix in 1894. And this picture shows you the kind of art that the Rose-Croix wanted to promote. It's Christian, because this was Catholic France and Switzerland. And he did a whole series of paintings of his son. And you've got his son kind of kneeling there. And this is a painting that is entitled What Will Happen, the Future. And it shows a tree in front of the little boy. And he's literally a dead tree. It has got no blossom, no flowers on it at all. But he's looking up to these women who are presumably meant to be angelic, and they're painted in white and pale blue and are images of purity. And the later series of the development of his son shows how his son actually moves from being the pure innocent child of this picture into adolescence and puberty. Now, this is a painting by another Belgian artist, Fernand Knopf. And again, like in the Redon, it shows you the head of Orpheus, which is a very popular theme in the symbolist movement, because it symbolized the theme of art. Orpheus sings, doesn't he? Orpheus plays the harp. Orpheus is a magician who charms the animals, and his music is the harmony of the universe. But he falls in love with a woman, Eurydice, and he tries to get her from the underworld. He fails, and then, because of the fact that he has failed to get Eurydice, he rejects women. And then the Furies, the Maenads, angry women, attack him, kill him, and behead him. And therefore, this head of Orpheus floating in a mystic nowhere, lying on his harp, is an image, I think, of the way in which it's a kind of disembodied art. He's left behind the world of love and lust. He's left behind the material, physical world that was painted by realists and impressionists. And instead, what you have here is a kind of vision of another spiritual world where art is the thing that can actually take you away from the ordinary world of sin and lust and materialism. And the next picture is another picture by Jean Delville, and this is a man called Stuart Merrill. Stuart Merrill was an American poet, but he came to Paris and lived there in the 1880s. And this is Delville's interpretation of what a symbolist poet should really be like, because he's got this incredible, strange intensity and stare. And it's thought that he's trying to show Stuart Merrill as a medium, where he is possessed by some sort of a spirit and then produces automatic writing in his poetry. So that in France, there was a powerful movement exhibiting in Paris in the 1890s, which tried to promote the Rose plus Croix Catholic mystical art. And there was also exhibitions organized by Les Nabis. And this is the cover of one of their books, a book about them. And Nabi is again another word for prophet. And this is the painting that announced the coming of their movement by an artist, Paul Serussier, who had gone to Pont-Aven in 1888 and met with Gauguin and was heavily influenced by Gauguin's ideas and style. And he produced paintings which were again supposed to be prophetic kind of paintings. So in this image of a wood, you have the artist going on bended knee into the forest of the world, prayed for by nuns like the Gauguin nuns that were painted in Pont-Aven, and shows the artist on a kind of spiritual quest. And the first painting he did, which is in this new style, is this next picture, which is called the Talisman. And that name is significant because a talisman is the old Arabic word for a magic charm or sigil. And this painting shows the way in which a new kind of occult art was produced. It led the critic Maurice Dennis in 1890 to produce a famous quote where he said that you should reject painting which is about myth or anecdote, and how a painting is really only simply an arrangement of colours and shapes on a canvas. And that's what this talisman is. And this painting became a talisman for the beginnings and development of abstract art. Now, these occult art movements existed all over Europe, and we're now going to Germany and the works of an artist called Hugo Hoppner, who actually was known by the name Fidus. And this is him, Fidus, with his signature. And Fidus was around in the 1890s at a time when there was a movement in German philosophy, literature, and art called Lebensreform, life reform. And it involved rejecting industrialization, rejecting materialism, rejecting bourgeois culture. And it encouraged artists to actually go and live in little communes away from the city in nature, and which then created a cult of living a reformed life where you no longer wore fashionable bourgeois clothes, you dressed as a peasant or you dressed as a priest. This is the moment when sandals become popular because you're actually literally touching the earth because they wanted to get back to nature. They were going to be vegetarians and not eat meat. They were going to actually be nudists and swim for joy in rivers and lakes. And Fidus became virtually their favorite artist, promoting the ideals of life reform. And if you look at this little black and white drawing, this shows you some of the ideals of life reform, with this little naked couple beginning to fall in love. And you can obviously recognize from the background and the outline of the figures that this is actually him working in what would be called the Art Nouveau style. But remember what Art Nouveau is called in German. It's Jugendstil, youth style. And therefore, it created a kind of cult of young, natural, nude figures and falling in love, like in this little drawing. And then in the next picture, you can see an even more Art Nouveau kind of frame that was created for it. And then you've got the couple of the new life reform, hand in hand, walking into the symbolic light of a better life. He also did nudes which are kind of more dominant, like in this picture here, which is his nudes, but this time nudes which are older, more heavily built, more masculine, with women rather beneath them, because he actually also was a nationalist, and life reform wanted to save Germany from the decadence of bourgeois culture and create a new kind of national identity of strength through joy. And when you look at figures like this, it's not surprising that in his later years, Fidus became very popular with the Nazis. Therefore, he was an artist who specialized in using the human body to express the ideals of getting back to nature. But he was also interested in other forms of the occult. This is a poster from Theosophische Kultur, which was the magazine of the Theosophical Society in Germany. And you can see how his nude figures and then the lotus blossoming and the sun in the background, the ideas come from the teachings of Theosophy that we talked about when we were doing that course on modernism. And he had a big idea, which never got into practice, of building a giant temple for the new religion. The drawings for it survive in the Berlin Museum. And as you can see, it is a very Art Nouveau kind of temple in terms of its design. And it was going to be on a vast scale, as you can see from the little person approaching it. But it was going to be a new temple to a new kind of religion. If you look inside, you can then see, can't you, the way in which it had an opening to the sky above, and it had the way in which the light is going to come down into the temple. And then in the temple itself, it's got here these figures which are going to be sculpted, which are going to be dancers of the soul. And you can see how the light was going to come directly down from the ceiling and spotlight them. And then on the end wall, when you look at the next picture of the interior, you can see how it's a vast building. It led to this oval of light. And then if you look at the bottom of the oval of light, do you see there's a little figure with its arms up? And this became his most famous image. And this is a watercolor version. He did lots of versions of it, which is the sun worshipper, because this is a solar temple, and he's worshipping the sun as the source of beauty and life. And therefore, you have this joyous figure on this rock promontory set against the sky, opening its arms to receive the beams of light and enlightenment into themselves. And though the temple was never built, the dancers who were going to adorn its walls have survived its paintings and are now in the Berlin Museum. So if you look at these are the dancers of the soul, and you can see how they're meant to link to the universe. So this is presumably linked to the sun. Then you get one that is linked to, it looks like a kind of giant swirl of the universe, and then this ecstatic kind of dance. And then you get to here, what I think is the most beautiful of the images, where you have the universe swirling around like those patterns in the background of the De Morgan tiles. And then you have this figure. And what I really admire in Fidus is not his realism, but his sense of style, the way in which he can place this figure on this blossoming branch against this circular background, and then give this incredible grace to the actual human figure. And in England, there was a movement again, that interested writers and artists, called the Golden Dawn. Its founder was S.L. MacGregor Mathers, and this is him in the full glory of his costume for one of their ceremonies. And this is surprisingly local. You have to, immediately after this, go straight to a cafe at 36 Blythe Road in Hammersmith, St George's Cafe, I think it's called, which is the building where they actually had one of their temples. And they attracted a wide range of philosophers, writers, artists who came to their meetings and practiced religious and magical rituals, which they believed helped them to get into a spirit world. And probably the most significant influence in the arts that they had was on W.B. Yeats, who at that time was living in Chiswick. And this is a book about what Yeats and the Golden Dawn, because he went to their meetings, he believed in their ideas, and although you know him as a fantastic poet, he also did some artwork, because he produced manuscripts of Golden Dawn rituals. This manuscript is handwritten by Blake, and on the left you can see all the occult signs which come from MacGregor Mathers' books on medieval magic. But then you can also see that it is a rose plus cross, rose and cross. It's Rosicrucian put together, the cross and then the circle of the rose. And therefore, W.B. Yeats experimented with actually doing occult paintings. And he produced figures like this. I apologize that this is such a terrible picture, but it is an example of how W.B. Yeats actually took the ideas of seeing visions, partly through rituals, chanting, maybe drugs as well, and then had visions of these falseful spiritual figures, not with a swastika, because you can see how it's an Indian symbol, which is actually of the sun, and therefore a kind of sun god appearing to him to fight against the materialism of the world. And though I would never claim that this is anything other than crap as art, I do believe that actually his poetry owes a lot to the discoveries he made through the ideas of the Golden Dawn and the kind of magical world that it created and its gyres and complexities. So you've got, therefore, the influence of the Golden Dawn, but probably the biggest influence on the arts was going to actually be from the Theosophical Society. And as you probably know from previous talks that we've had, Madame Blavatsky at the centre here was the person who created the Theosophical Society in London. She produced books with ideas which were about theosophy. Sophia is love, and Theos is God, and therefore she produced books which were about how all religions could be united together, and how there were certain sort of basic occult truths at the basis of both the religions of the West and of the East. And therefore, she had a big influence in creating a society which, as we saw, spread all over the world. And this is theosophical propaganda, where it's her at the center, and then a group of people who they claim were heavily influenced by her. And I think I recognize Gandhi. I think I recognize the Dalai Lama. I think I recognize Einstein. And I think second down on the right is that Mondrian. But basically, the argument is that actually the Theosophical Society influenced lots of artists, and therefore was the biggest occult influence on the development of art in the late 19th century. Her follower, who had the biggest effect on the artists, was a man called C.W. Ledbetter. And C.W. Ledbetter produced this book called Thought Forms. You notice that this particular edition was printed in Adyar, because the Theosophical Society was in Gloucester Terrace in London, but she also had headquarters in India. And this book, Thought Forms, took up the ideas of the Theosophical Society. And what it did was to claim that actually, when you got into a visionary state through use of drugs, meditation, use of mantras and yantras from the East, you would then actually get visions that appeared in your head and came from other higher spiritual worlds. And he believed in what was called astral projection, whereby these techniques you could rise above your physical material world and you could get into the world of the stars and the spirits. And then into your head came visions. And if you open his book, this is what you see. A text on the left that explains these pictures on the right, which are the thought forms. And they are going to be all sorts of different things. Some are going to be wild and horrible and are evil astral spirits coming into you. But these ones are meant to be ones of beauty and harmony. So you've got the Art Nouveau kind of pearl sort of shape at the top. And then you've got the one at the bottom that represents ideas of unity, where all the different colors blend together and all the shapes in the universe link together, and you get a sense of spiritual harmony. But when you look at this next one, aren't you looking at Malevich? This is a thought form. This is one of the abstract images in this book, produced in 1905 in England by a theosophist. And this book was translated into different languages and was read all over the world and was actually influential on various different artists who began to create the beginnings of abstract art. Another artist who got interested in philosophy, this is the Finnish artist, Galen Kalela, who mostly is known for doing fairly realistic pictures of Finnish folklore and myth. But in 1894, he was in Paris and he produced this picture, which is called Ad Astra. You can see from the wings that the patterns are very much Art Nouveau, but then he has this idea of Ad Astra, rising to the stars. And this woman is, as you can see, floating from nowhere up into the ether. And do you see how her pose, arms upstretched to reach the spiritual, is very similar to the Fides sun worshipper. But probably the most significant influence in art was, as I was about to say, on Mondrian. And when you look at this picture here, this is 1910-11, and this is a Mondrian painting that is entitled Evolution. And it represents ideas that he took directly from theosophy. The figure on the left has these flowers, lozenges, and in them, do you see there are black triangles that point downwards? And that may well meant to represent the physical material world. Then on the right, you've got the next figure where you have a kind of yellow, fiery, solar kind of flower. And the triangles in that point up and is therefore meant to be a rising of the person evolving to the spiritual. And then if you look at the center, you've got the union together of the two forms. You've got the material going down, but is now lifted up by the spiritual. And then you get this blend, which puts them together. And Madame Blavatsky believed in the original androgyne created by God in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve. She believed in the universe being male and female and an ideal of harmony and unity in androgyny. And therefore you have this central figure, which is a figure of the ideal human. But there's another level of meaning as well. The triangle pointing down probably also implies pubic hair, and therefore might well represent the theosophical misogyny of how the woman tends to be the more materialistic of figures, whereas the male on the right, the fire, rises up to the higher intellectual and spiritual. But the ideal in Madame Blavatsky is that the two come together. And therefore, this is a symbolist painting about theosophical ideas of evolution. But it is also probably the origin of how his style actually developed. When you look at this next montage, you see the development of his style over about 20 years. On the top left, you've got an expressionist red tree. Next picture, it becomes cubist. Then it becomes slightly more abstract. Then on the bottom row, you begin to get these purely abstract shapes. And then in the last two pictures, you do get what actually you expect to be a true Mondrian, where you've got the colors and shapes put together as he was painting in the 1920s. That last image is purely black and white. and it only consists of a series of horizontal black lines and vertical black lines, and they interlock together. And from Madame Blavatsky, she argued that the horizontal represented the female, the vertical represented the male, and therefore, in these most abstract of pictures that he ever created, I think you've got theosophical ideas of how actually the universe needs to lock together and how the different abstract shapes coalesce into one form, which is like William Blake's notion of blending of male and female together, locked together in a real kind of harmony. And the other artist who was actually heavily influenced to move towards abstraction by theosophy was Kandinsky. As you probably know, by 1912-13, he was producing a series of pictures which were entitled Improvisations and Compositions. And that means that they're no longer representational art. Instead, they are compositions which involve point, line, and plane and color. And they put the things together in purely abstract kind of ways. And this particular painting has got a significant title. It's called Vibrations. And the notion of vibrations comes directly from C.W. Ledbetter's thought forms. He believed that spirits, the spiritual in the universe, resonated through the universe in a cosmic harmony of vibrations. And therefore, this is the Beach Boys' good vibrations coming out to us, because Kandinsky wrote about how he believed and hoped that actually his art would create vibrations in our soul, and therefore we would feel joy and emotions from his paintings. So in my opinion, these romantic visions from the occult world were going to be very significant in terms of actually creating a new kind of art. And therefore, we've looked at the way in which in the 19th century, romantic visionaries create occult art. There's going to be a gap where there are other talks and there's half term. And then there are two more talks that will happen at some point in November, where we'll look at 20th century occult. That's going to be Eric Gill, Aleister Crowley, Osmond Spare. And then a final talk where I'm going to argue that there may really be something magical about art and why we enjoy it. So see whether there are any questions you want to raise.
Thank you so much, Robert. As always, I learned something about an artist that I thought I knew lots about. Does anyone want to, I see some of you have unmuted yourselves. If you don't mind just letting me know first, and then we can, just to make sure everyone gets in. With the blue shirt, I can't see with blue shirt and glasses, it just says iPad, so I'm afraid I don't know your name.
It's,
Please go ahead.
David.
Hi, David.
Please.
Hi, Robert. Sorry, I hope you don't mind. This is just a quibble rather than a question, but the Jean Delville painting of Stuart Merrill, that is in fact Mrs. Stuart Merrill.
My mistake.
That's
I was
okay.
worried about what his gender fluidity was about.
That's his wife.
Thank you.
That's okay.
And most of the mediums were women rather than men, weren't they?
That's right. And in fact, I was going to mention that at the Courtauld in 2016, there was an exhibition of an English medium called Georgiana Houghton, who painted abstract, which was...
Nikki French particularly likes her work.
Oh, does she? I didn't know that. Right.
Yes.
Yeah, we must have a chat then. Thank you.
So, Robert, just a quick question. It's Robert here. The German painters that were painting the human form, and there was a movement towards nakedness. Where did that naturalistic nudity actually spring from? Was that the actual beginnings of that movement, or was there
very
some?
much so. You may well have gathered from Life Reform and the pictures that Fidesz was creating that it looked very, very hippie, doesn't it? And it came as it was revived and popular in the 1960s. But basically, all over Europe, there were people who were reacting against the kind of prudery of bourgeois 19th century art and wanting to revalue the body. They wanted nudes to be appearing more realistically in art. And they also were moving away from the kind of traditional theological view of the body as sinful. And there were lots of writers and artists in the late 19th century were developing a kind of cult of the body and wanting to make belief in humanity and belief in the human physical life the core of their existence. Have you ever come across a book by Paul Delaney called The Neo-Pagans? And that's about the way in which this movement was very popular in England in the early 20th century, how it influenced artists like Augustus John, and it also influenced poets like Rupert Brooke. So therefore, it was a very widespread movement to reject traditional 19th century religious and bourgeois morality in favor of the life of the body.
But the English take on this versus the German take on it was quite different, because it becomes part of the national drive to bodily perfection within Germany and the outbound movement.
You're right that it gets linked into the sort of fascist ideas of developing the German nation, but there were plenty of people in England who actually tried to promote it as, again, what was needed for England in case England was becoming a degenerate country. So it happened all over Europe. It was in France as well. Was
there any connection to the forest school movement in any way?
Yes, there are free schools all over. The best example of that in England is a place called Abbotsholme. And if you looked up Abbotsholme, you'd find that was created by, I think it's C.R. Reddy, and he's left books which describe the beliefs of the school and how they did intellectual learning in school, but they also were going to go out and work in the farm that belonged to the school. They were going to swim nude in the rivers nearby, and at the center of their chapel, there was actually a sculpture of a nude boy. Therefore, the educational reform movement definitely existed, and it passes on from Abbotsholme to other schools that you've probably come across in the sort of free education movement.
I think you might have misheard me. I said the forest school movement.
You said forest school?
Yes.
There was a group.
Well, they actually had classes.
Go on, say what you can say.
No, I think it was quite popular in Scotland, but I mean, it might have had some kind of connection to this outbound life, and maybe not so naked in Scotland, but some of the ethos might have been there.
What was the school that Prince Philip was sent?
That's Gordonstone, but that's a slightly different. That's not a forest school. That's just hardcore, miserable.
No, he came from Kurt Weill came from Germany and brought the ideas of the German
really?
School.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So that's, but it wasn't necessarily. It was more about hardship of the body and training the character.
Well, that's the fascist side of the body cult, isn't it?
Oh, okay. All right. Good to see that connection. Thank you.
Does anyone else have a question they'd like to ask of Robert? All right, well, then I will say thank you. Thank you so much, Robert. As always, it's been informative and inspiring, and you continue to teach all of us in such a fascinating way. If you're keen to join the remainder of Robert's talks, you can do so by clicking on the link that will be in the chat facility. If you can't make it, you can always watch our talks, including Robert's previous talks on Impressionism, Expressionism, Abstraction, in our video library, which is on our website. Or you can copy the link from the chat here as well. You'll also find a link there to the bursary in Robert's name, if anyone would like to make a donation, along with the link to all of our other forthcoming events. Thank you to you, our audience, for your great participation. I wanted to let you know that the Virtually Speaking series continues, and the full program is on the side in the talk now. Next week, author and Latimer parent Ariana Newman dives into the secret of her father's past, spying for the Allies in plain sight in war-torn Berlin, the Holocaust, and the courageous choice to build a new life. Ariana will discuss her new book, which is called When Time Stopped, a memoir of my father's war and what remains. I know many of you here will have seen Gay Search's talk on spies not that long ago, and I hope you might enjoy this one as well. Sadly, that brings us to the end of today's lunchtime lecture. Thank you everyone so much for joining us. Thank you, Robert, for keeping us engaged with your incredible, endless knowledge. Tony, thank you for your IT support. And I do hope we see you all again soon. Goodbye.